All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming here on this cold and drizzly February night. My name is Jim Wallace. I am the Executive Committee Chair for the Northwest Cook County Group, the Illinois chapter of the Sierra Club. And tonight we have a really good program. Looking forward to this. It's going to be a little longer than usual. We have three presenters, two for the first presentation, and then one for the second half of the presentation. And there will be Q&A, 10 to 15 minutes after each presentation. So there's two halves to this program. So I don't have many announcements because we will have those two Q&A, so I don't want to take up a whole lot of time. And also, I just mentioned that the chat is disabled, but during Q&A, Pat will open it up for us, and we can have both chat questions, comments, and also in-house if we get some more people coming in here. So first, just a couple of announcements. Keep checking our website. Obviously, you found this meeting, most of you, through our website. So go there. You can click on the events calendar, see what's coming up. Pretty much have, I think we pretty much have our program meeting set for March and April and May. But we'll definitely for March, and that'll be appearing pretty soon. And it's again, it's the second Thursday of the month. Also go to our Get Involved webpage to see all our committees listed and how each one of you can get involved with Sierra Club or specifically the Northwest Cook County. And one of the things you can get involved in, one of the committees, is the political committee, and I'm glad to see Barbara here, and then also Paul Culhane. I don't know if he's here, but anyway, elections are coming up, April 4th, local elections. And so there are plenty of candidates in your local area, no doubt. And, it'd be good to see how they stand on environmental issues. So either Barbara, I don't know if Paul's here, but Barbara, would you like to say a couple words about that?
Well, I guess maybe if you are interested, I mean, we have several plates. Let's see, we're currently, oh man, if I can remember, Paul is keeping on top of this better than I am, and he's at choir practice now. That's why he's not here. But let's see, we currently are looking at making endorsements in Des Plaines. Maybe, I mean, all of these are maybes. We're just looking to see, does somebody deserve an endorsement? And right now we're looking at Des Plaines and Elk Grove Village and Arlington Heights. And I think that's it. So if we do make endorsements there, we will be looking for people to help us campaign for, environmentalist candidates running for local office. And if you live, this relies very much on having local volunteers who know what the local issues are. We have a generic question. I mean, if you want to see Sierra Club make an endorsement in your municipality, send email. I guess the best way probably is to send email. That you can go to our website and there's some kind of contact us thing, right?
Right.
And that might be the right way. I mean, time is racing by quickly, and it's getting a little bit late to get started on any new municipalities. But, I mean, who knows? Maybe it's possible. So, yeah, we will certainly be publicizing whatever endorsements we manage to make. And I mean, the municipal ones, in a lot of ways, you can have more influence at the municipal level than at any other level of government. So it's a fun thing to get involved in.
Thank you, Barbara. And as usual, you can send emails to nwccSierraClub@gmail.com, and that goes to a bunch of people and all the XCOM, well, not a bunch of people, but all the XCOM members, including committee chairs, and Barbara will see it. I'll see it and forward it on.
Oh, it occurs to me, maybe we should have mentioned, because, there are a number of unfamiliar faces, well, unfamiliar black squares on this screen tonight, that our group's territory goes from Park Ridge to the Barringtons. And, Cook County, Illinois, the northwest part of Cook County, as you might guess from our name.
Right. Yeah, that's good to know. And it's good for all of us to know. I forget that too, Barbara. So thanks. All right, well, let's get to the program. Thank you very much, Barbara. And tonight we're very fortunate. We have three presenters, two representing advocates for green nuclear energy that will be compatible with green environmental. So so we have Alan Metzger. He's a telecommunications engineer. He's a contributor to the blog site Fourth Generation. He also belongs to Thorium Energy Alliance, which is this new technology I just learned about too long ago, molten salt reactors. And thorium is a material, I believe. And it's Alan's passion as an advocate of nuclear energy. And he's also a frequent attendee and speaker at the conferences. And he's written many published articles, and he's been in radio interviews. He's also advocated to save existing nuclear plants for nearly a decade now. So it's a way to maintain green economic growth and addressing social inequities with robust jobs growth. And so we also have Maddie Hildy, an associate that they work together on some things. And she is a former researcher and analyst, then became the executive VP for Environmental Progress, a pro-nuclear research and policy organization for California. She's the founder and current executive director at the Campaign for a Green Nuclear Deal. And Alan is the coordinator, for the Illinois coordinator for that. And it's a new vision for nuclear growth and jobs creation. She's also a worldwide traveler as a pro-nuclear advisor and activist, advising policymakers and journalists. So without further ado, whichever one of you wants to start out, Alan or Maddie?
Well, thank you for that introduction, Jim. I will go ahead and start sharing my screen. All right. Alan, do you want to quick introduce yourself? Or
sure.
Reintroduce yourself?
Sure. So you heard a lot about me there. I'm Alan Metzger. I live in Arlington Heights, and I have a day job that's a telecommunications engineer. And then in my spare time, one of the things that I do is I advocate for nuclear energy because I think it's a good idea to use more. So I think the other details that were shared are probably enough. So Maddie, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, and I'm Maddie Hilly. I'm from Tinley Park. My husband's from Chicago, and we currently live in Chicago. As was said, I became an independent nuclear advocate in 2020, so about 3 years ago now. And that means that while this is my day job, I take no energy industry money and no money from big NGOs. Any of the money that the Campaign for a Green Nuclear Deal raises comes from small donors on Patreon. Currently, that's about $400 a month. And then the rest of my travels or advocacy or efforts, my husband and I pay out of pocket. And I just say that because I think it's really important. While this work isn't lucrative, like many of you, I think that advocacy is so valuable, and independent advocacy is even more so. So I will let Alan take us away then.
Okay, thanks, Maddie. So we're going to start off tonight by just taking a quick look at how a nuclear plant works, how it generates electricity. And this is a very, very basic diagram, but you kind of get the idea. In a nuclear plant, you have a nuclear reactor, one or more of those. And if you can see my mouse, if you could see my mouse, you would see that it's circling around that reactor vessel that's on the left side of the screen. That's where the heat is generated. And that heat is used to turn water into steam. And the light blue pipes that go out the top of the containment structure there, carry that steam to a turbine which spins under the pressure of the steam. That turbine then in turn spins a generator which is hooked up to the electric grid and provides electricity to homes and industry and anybody else that needs it. The steam, we'll go just back just for a bit. Maddie,
Oh,
back
is
up
it
just,
not back?
I'm sorry, back up.
Oh, it's showing back on
Yeah.
mine. Is it not basic
I-
overview on yours?
I have the diagram again. Yes, that's fine.
Oh,
So the water that goes and turns to steam has to be cooled back into water, so it condenses after it goes to the turbine. And there's a cooling system that sometimes you'll see large cooling towers outside of a nuclear plant. Other power plants have those too, but they are always for ejecting the excess heat into the environment. And what comes out of the top of those towers is just water vapor. It's like clouds. Not nothing, there's no pollution that comes out of there. But that's sometimes how you cool it. Sometimes you need a body of water instead of some sort, a river or an artificial lake or something that's used to cool that. And that water then is recirculated back into the containment structure to get heated again, turned into steam again, and make more energy. Next slide. So what heats that water? What is actually in there? Well, there's nuclear fuel that's configured in a way in there that it will be allowed to, when we want it to, create a chain reaction, which we'll get to in a minute. But that nuclear fuel is made of uranium. We have uranium pellets that are manufactured using uranium that we mine. And those pellets are tiny. They're like the size of the tip of your pinky or maybe a pencil eraser, something like that. We stack a bunch of those up inside a tube that's called cladding. That's usually a zinc alloy of some sort that's made up, that tube's made up of. And then at the very top, we'll put a little spring in there to keep them from jiggling around to accommodate the expansion and contraction of those fuel pellets when they get hot. And then that tube is sealed up completely. It's hermetically sealed. It's welded shut. So all of those pellets are inside there. And then we turn that into a fuel rod. So step 3 you see here. And the fuel rod has a couple of extra components that allow it to be assembled into a fuel assembly, which is the last part of the diagram, number 4 there. That fuel assembly could be 13 feet. It could be some other length depending on the reactor type. It could also be a different shape than what you see here. You might see a trapezoid in the end instead of a rectangle, but it's all basically the same kind of thing, and it all uses those same basic kind of uranium pellets at the core. So there might be 150, 175 of these fuel assemblies that go into the core of a large nuclear reactor. Next. So that fission that we talked about, so we saw the big things, the fuel assembly. Now we see the very, very tiny things. And this incident neutron on the left, I always get a kick out of that. It's like the neutron's going to cause an incident. He's a bad guy. And the way that he causes an incident is he's going to hit a fissile nucleus, and that's what that uranium fuel contains, is a fissile nuclei, elements of isotopes of uranium that will split when they're hit with a neutron. And so that nucleus splits when it's hit with a neutron. And when that split happens, a massive amount of energy is released in the form of heat. So we have lots of heat that we get from that. In addition, we get some extra neutrons that come out of that split, and those go on to create other incidents, split other nuclei of the uranium fuel. So when that keeps happening, then that's called a chain reaction. And we do have ways to control that, but that's how the heat gets generated. So U-235, which is the isotope that we actually it is that fissile isotope that we talked about that splits when you hit it with an atom or with a neutron. It's got 2 to 3 million times as much energy per weight per gram as as the same amount of oil or gas or coal, I guess, in this case. So that little uranium pellet that you saw, again, it's about the size of a pencil eraser. It has as much energy in it as 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas or 150 gallons of oil or a ton of coal. So there's a lot of energy in that little tiny thing. And you know, the processes that happen to create that heat. On the left side, it's a nuclear process. On the right side, it's a chemical process of combustion. The chemical process of combustion emits a lot of things that we don't like into the atmosphere, and that's why we want to reduce the use of those where we can. So one of the advantages that nuclear has, because the fuel is so dense, because we need so little space to generate lots of energy, is that the actual power plant size, the amount of land that we need to create to produce a certain amount of energy is lower than it would be for some other sources of clean energy. And this is just a representative example here. So you see a nuclear plant that might take a square mile with all the different buildings and buffer space and everything that we put around it. The wind turbines need space in between them, and they're going to take up a lot more land. We can certainly optimize the use of that land, and sometimes we can farm in between or do other things to make better use of that. But it does require a lot of space, and so this just gives you an idea of the difference there. One of the reasons we like nuclear is because it has low life cycle emissions, and when I say life cycle, I mean all the way from mining any of the things that we need to build or fuel the plant, all the way through the decommissioning process of it at the end of its life. And so nuclear, wind, solar, and hydro all are considered clean energy sources, and they all have very low emissions levels. Hydro is a little bit higher here. You can see because of the effects of creating a big reservoir and using lots and lots of concrete in a dam that produces some emissions. So, but when you start burning things, as you can see on the right side of the graph, that's when the emissions go way up. So in particular, the gas, oil, and coal, the fossil fuels that are shown here emit a lot of grams per kilowatt hour. So that's what we want to stay away from. And even biomass, even though it's not a fossil fuel, it still does emit CO2. Again, as a life cycle measurement, all the different components that go into that energy generation process are accounted for here. So, and this is, you can go to ourworldindata.org and get some really great graphs like this one.
I think someone
Next.
is drawing on the slide accidentally because I'm struggling to click through. Let me try escaping and stop share. Oh,
There we go.
there we go. Okay.
So because we don't need much fuel to create a lot of energy, because the energy density of nuclear is so high, what goes in has to come out somehow. And in a nuclear plant, that means that the fuel assemblies that go in eventually have to come back out again. When they come back out, they're not usable in that reactor anymore, so they have to be changed out. And we put them in a storage pool for a while, and then in some dry casks to store them for longer periods of time. But if you took all of that used fuel from all of the nuclear generation of all of our country, the US, from when we invented it and started using it until now, so 70 years or so of generation, and currently it generates close to 20% of our electricity. If you take all of that used fuel, you stack it up on a football field here, to give you some idea, about 50 feet. And it would all, you could put it all there. And that's a very tiny amount for the amount of energy that we've generated with those nuclear plants. So it's a much, much smaller amount of waste, a smaller waste stream than really any other energy generation technology that we have. And because it's such a small amount, we are able to manage it effectively and relatively easily. And we have a perfect safety record with it. So we do know how to handle it, and it's again, we know where every gram of it is. We don't, it gets tracked, all of it. So that's a really important part. And, we feel like all of our big waste streams could learn lessons from the way that we handle nuclear waste. And if we did a better job of not just throwing stuff into landfills and that sort of thing, it would serve us better. So we hope that more people start doing this kind of thing. From a reliability perspective, some of the things that we actually like about fossil fuels is that they're dispatchable. In other words, we can turn them on and off when we need to. And generally speaking, they're pretty reliable. Obviously, the whole system has to be reliable. As we found out in Texas last year, some of the fossil fuel plants didn't work because they couldn't get fuel. But generally speaking, if we design right and we plan for the right weather, those are reliable, but they are not clean. They are not carbon free. They kill people every year from the emissions that come out of them, and so we don't like them for that reason. But they've served us well from a reliability and a dispatchability point of view. The clean energy sources that we have, solar and wind, are not dispatchable and reliable. They require some help from some other source to bridge the gaps in between when they're generating and when they're not. But they are carbon free, and that means a lot. So we want to use them where they make sense and where we can, because we need all the clean energy that we can get. Nuclear energy has advantage here as of being able to check all of those boxes. So it's clean and carbon free. Generally speaking, again, those numbers are very low. They're not zero, but they're very low for all the clean energy sources shown here, and it's reliable and dispatchable. So we can, we have control over when it runs and when it doesn't, and so that's a big advantage. Here in Illinois, we have 6 nuclear plants. These nuclear plants are kind of located in the northern part of the state where the population center is, Chicagoland here. Lots of people here, and sort of out by Rockford Way as well. These plants each have 2 reactors, except for the Clinton plant, which just have 1. So it means of the 6 plants, we have 11 reactors shown. Together, those reactors produce over 50% of our electricity statewide, just those 6 sites. And of the clean electricity that we have, they generate the vast majority of that. In 2021, I think these numbers are for. That was 83% of our clean electricity came from those 6 nuclear plants. We got quite a bit from wind, as you can see here, and we are starting to get a little bit more from solar. So those have contributed as well. And the CEJA bill, which many of you worked alongside me and with Maddie to pass last year, there was a lot of things in that bill. It was a big bill, and one of the things that was in there was some provisions to keep our nuclear plants open. They were financially stressed, a couple of them at the time, and their owner was going to close them down if they didn't get a little bit of help. So we gave them that help, but we also gave them a little bit more of a provision that allows them to make, when they're making more money on energy, when the prices go up, they have to pay some of that back to the ratepayer. And so I get 20 or 25 bucks back on my electric bill these days on a monthly bill. And my bill's not that big, but there's a lot of rebate money that's happened here. And that's due to the fact that we put that really great provision into this bill. So it works both ways. We didn't just bail out the nuclear plants. We said, if you guys make a lot of money, we want some of it back. And so they're giving some of it back. So thank you, everybody that worked on CEJA. That was a really awesome win.
Thanks, Alan. So one of the issues, or the biggest issue that I see is a barrier to scaling up nuclear energy, despite all of these amazing benefits that Alan just talked about, is that there are pervasive misconceptions and concerns about nuclear. And one of my biggest critiques of the nuclear industry is that they are absolutely terrible at communication. I frankly think that they have completely failed at engaging with the public and having conversations with communities about nuclear energy. So that's a lot of the work that Alan and I like to do. So one of the things that we hear a lot is that nuclear is too slow to scale up, especially with climate change being so urgent that it just can't get built fast enough. But when you look at the data, this is from the BP Statistical Review of World Energy, dating all the way back to the 60s. The 10 largest deployments, 10-year deployments of low carbon electricity generation, the only technology that was faster than nuclear was hydro. And we know that hydro is limited by geography and geology, meaning you can't just build it anywhere. And, it's, as conservationists, we can't ignore the ecological impacts of hydro. So if we set hydro aside and we look at the remaining 20 fastest or 20 greatest 10-year decarbonization efforts, nuclear clearly is the fastest proven way to scale up carbon-free energy. Now, it's a fair point to say, a lot of these builds are historical. They're from the 70s, the 80s, or 90s. Do we think that nuclear can actually be built at scale quickly today? And one of the stories that I think is fascinating that says yes is a nuclear newcomer. That's the UAE. They started exploring nuclear energy in the early 2000s, and 10 years ago, they broke ground on their first ever nuclear power plant, Barakah. So far, they have 3 reactors online. By next year, the 11th year, all 4 will be online. And these 4 massive nuclear reactors will represent 25% of their country's electricity, which is carbon-free. And that's amazing because the UAE is a very fossil fuel dominated state. So even newcomers to nuclear are able to start programs and get results of clean energy within a decade. Another thing we hear is that nuclear is too expensive, especially when you compare with the declining cost of solar and wind. Why would you invest in nuclear? And to be fair, it's undeniable that nuclear plants require much, much more money up front than solar or wind do. But when we look at electricity systems, so not just the cost coming out of any given plant, but the system as a whole, what we find is that low carbon systems that include nuclear have much cheaper systems and thus much cheaper electricities than systems without nuclear. So for example, California has been the US leader in renewable energy. It's spent $100 billion on wind, solar, and storage since the early 2000s. And in 2020, the carbon intensity of electricity being generated in California was just about as clean as Illinois' actually. But in Illinois, we paid half as much for our electricity. So having that nuclear backbone to protect against the volatility of expensive fossil fuels was really important. And we see this trend. This is just pointing out that California now has the second highest electricity prices in the nation, only second to Hawaii. And we see this trend elsewhere too. Germany is famously attempting to phase out not only fossil fuels, but it's nuclear plants and replace both sources of energy with renewables. It will, through 2025, have spent $580 billion trying to do so. And it has also seen its electricity prices rise. Well, when you look to its neighbor, France, who gets about 70% of its total electricity from nuclear, French electricity is 8 times cleaner. So its carbon intensity of electricity is 8 times less than Germany's, and they pay about 2/3 of the cost. So what I like to say is that nuclear is an expensive way to make electricity cheap, and ignoring nuclear is a cheap way to make electricity expensive. Even if you accept that nuclear can scale up and that nuclear may actually help our low carbon energy systems become more affordable, some people are really afraid of it. They say the risk is too great and are particularly concerned about the accidents. And to be fair, I mean, I graduated from college knowing nothing about nuclear. And so the idea of a Chernobyl happening here terrified me. But then I dug into the data. And again, this is from University of Oxford's Our World in Data. And when they took a look at the question, they found that nuclear is the safest way to produce reliable, dispatchable electricity. You can see it's on that same teeny tiny order of magnitude as solar and wind. And this sort of surprised me because the accidents loomed so large in my mind. And so it really helped me to go through each of the accidents. And I'm going to briefly touch, not do any of them the service they deserve, but I will send this presentation and a bunch of different resources on afterwards to be shared for any folks who want to dig in deeper. The first one, the first big accident, was 3 Mile Island. That was a partial meltdown in Pennsylvania in 1979. There were no deaths or injuries. For people living in that area, they received a dose, an estimated dose of radiation that was 1 to 10% of their normal background dose of radiation. So the normal dose they get from just living in that part of the country, very teeny tiny. And because the radiation or the radioactive materials were contained, various studies from different governmental agencies, universities, external NGOs found that there would be no significant impact on the river or the rest of the environment. When you think about the worst case scenario for nuclear, it's Chernobyl, and it truly was. I mean, this was a nuclear reactor with its core exposed to the environment, on fire, spewing radioactive particles. I mean, I can't imagine the terror of having to live through that. It's unimaginable to me. I'm very fortunate that I have the benefit of hindsight and decades worth of analyses and data to look at this accident with. So this comes from the United Nations Scientific Committee's health report on Chernobyl. And what they say is that 3 workers died from the initial steam explosion. 28 firefighters, first responders, died from acute radiation syndrome. And 15 people died prematurely from thyroid cancer in the first 25 years after the accident. So with a helicopter crash that occurred on that day, that's 50 of deaths that we've observed thus far. As far as future deaths, the UN says that a possible 145 more additional premature deaths may occur from thyroid cancer. So the maximum death count for Chernobyl being 200, according to the UN, again, shocked me. It just seemed so different than what I imagined in my mind. And there were no increases in any other types of cancer, including in that liquidator cohort, the ones who cleaned up the reactor, no effects on fertility, infant mortality, or birth defects. And in fact, me living in Chicago has an increased risk mortality 2.8 times greater than the radiation posed to the most exposed group of Chernobyl liquidators. So it's really important when we talk about radiation to put that into context with other risks that we take, like passive smoking or living in a megacity. And if there is a silver lining to such a terrible accident, it's that it's been this accidental experiment in rewilding, where because of the lack of human activity, the flora and fauna within the Chernobyl exclusion zone have flourished. Actually, it's now the continent's third largest wildlife reserve. But this is not to say that any part that the Chernobyl exclusion zone doesn't have people in it. Not only was the Chernobyl exclusion zone not uninhabitable, not even the plant was rendered uninhabitable. In fact, a few months after the accident, people went back to work and the other 3 reactors continued to power Ukraine until the year 2000. And again, this is not at all to minimize what this accident was. All it's meant to show is that in a worst case scenario for nuclear, the health and environmental impacts are typically much, much smaller than what we think, and certainly much smaller than the normal everyday functioning of the fossil fuels they replace. Lastly, we have Fukushima, where unfortunately 2 workers died in the basement of the nuclear power plant. They drowned from the tsunami, but there were no deaths from the radiation release. And similarly, no health impacts, no increased instances of cancer. And we hear a lot about Fukushima food and water. The tritiated water basically the tritium, which is what people are concerned about, it doesn't bioaccumulate. So the concern about produce or fish is just unfounded. Actually, the US just signed a contract with the Fukushima prefecture to import rice to the United States. And again, with radiation, it's important to know it's all about the dose. So you would have to drink, and again, wouldn't advise this, but you would have to drink 3.5 liters of Fukushima water just to get the same dose of radiation as eating 1 Brazil nut. So it's kind of the solution to pollution is dilution. Well, this is already extremely dilute. And then lastly, sort of related to the accidents, people are also scared about the waste. And I think people are scared about the waste because they don't know what it looks like. I certainly thought it was green and glowing because, again, my only encounter with nuclear before I ran into the environmental case for nuclear had been The Simpsons. But in reality, nuclear waste is pretty boring. So Alan described what a fuel assembly was. That bottom right picture is me with a fuel assembly. And that's what the waste is. You pull that out, and that spent fuel is what eventually in the United States gets loaded into the top right corner, those casks. And these are big steel concrete containers. You can hug it, although we have to convince utilities that they should be allowed to let people hug it. But there are no moving pieces. It sits on concrete slabs that are very small. In the top left corner, that's a selfie with me and the nuclear waste in Zion, Illinois. And that bottom left picture is something that the Netherlands does, where they actually put their waste in a central repository where members of the public are allowed to visit. It's actually an art gallery for large art installations. They have field trips there. They bring school children there to walk on top of the waste and talk about nuclear power. A lot of people propose putting this deep underground, but as an environmentalist, I don't particularly like that solution because when the spent fuel is done, 90% of the potential energy in that uranium is still left, which means we can recycle it and use it for more clean energy. That's already done in France, Russia, Japan. And so why would you put future carbon-free fuel where you can't get to it? Anyways, I'm throwing so much information at you. Like I said, the sources on all of these slides are at the bottom. I sent along the presentation, as well as a bunch of things that Alan and I have written on these subjects that also include all the links, all the citations for anyone who wants to do a deeper dive. But I do want to end on this note, which is from a book I read in 2017 that was fascinating. It was called Critical Masses. And it told the story of how Will Seery, who was a very famous president and director of the Sierra Club, actually was instrumental in getting the nuclear power plant in California built. So he recognized the conservation value for nuclear because, like we said, it can replace fossil fuels and it takes up so little land that more land can be set aside for nature and open spaces. But when the utility proposed Diablo Canyon, they proposed to build it on a site of high ecological value, some dunes on the coast of California. So the Sierra Club actually worked with and struck a deal with the utility to get that plant moved so that they could protect that national treasure. And so the Sierra Club has clearly been a force for immense good. And this is sort of a working example of how the Sierra Club could, going forward, work to get nuclear plants built to combat climate change while also protecting the land's public spaces and lands of high ecological value for the public to enjoy. So I know I've probably gone a bit over, but I would love, Alan, I would love to field any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Maddie, and thank you, Alan. Let's just go to the chats right away and see if anybody has.
I've enabled the chat.
Want to open up the chat?
Yeah, it's open.
Okay, does anybody have any questions out in Zoom land?
They're coming in.
I do. Okay, well, we got a question here. You want to come up to the mic? All right, bring the mic to you.
The spent fuel, I mean, not the spent fuel, but the pellets in the tubes, how are they turned on and off? Put them into the reactor, and then they're turned on, and how do they get shut off? I would like to know.
Okay, so it sounds like the question is, when you load the uranium into the reactor, how does it turn on and off? How do you turn the reaction on and off?
That's what I got. Yes.
Okay, Alan, do you want to tackle that one?
Sure. So, the reactor is controlled by special rods that are inserted into those fuel assemblies when the core is assembled, and those rods are called control rods, appropriately enough, and they contain material that absorbs all of those neutrons that are flying around, and when you insert those into the reactor, it's capable of shutting off the chain reaction completely and pretty quickly. So that's those are used to adjust the level of power of the reactor when needed, to shut it down when it needs to shut down, for because there's a trip of some sort, or because there's planned maintenance, and then maybe they'll be pulled all the way out when they need to run it at full power.
Thank you, Alan. And we have a couple questions in the chat. Go ahead, read them off, Pat.
Well, we have a question from Renee that's asking about, what do you mean that Fukushima water is safe? Which water?
Yeah, so when the Fukushima Daiichi reactors melted down, they basically had to pour water over the reactor to cool it. And so you get this large amount of water that has radioactive materials. That's the tritium I was talking about. And so that water has been treated, but it still has tritium in it at this concentration that I was saying. It's like 15,000 becquerels. I'm even hesitant to cite that because I forget the exact unit, but that has been a very highly contested issue where should they be allowed to release that into the ocean? And like I said, we are talking about an extremely low concentration, but anytime that you talk about releasing anything into the environment, it certainly warrants extra caution and analysis. So that's why it's been about 12 years and the decision has just been made this past year.
So there's another question this is going to be a long one, so I ask you to sort of
Yeah,
paraphrase it. There are other pollutants in the world besides carbon dioxide, and what are the other things that it can affect, like uranium mining, milling, refining, assembly emission, the emissions of operating a nuclear reactor, things that leak from waste where it's stored. So again, this is almost a whole nother presentation. So if you could just sort of basically answer the question about what other pollutants in the world are a concern in nuclear energy. And that goes to the next question about the carbon footprint in mining and refining and bringing uranium to use in a nuclear plant.
Alan, do you want to do it or do you want me to?
Go ahead.
Okay, so when Alan was talking about the cooling towers, we've all driven past, or at least I have, living in Northern Illinois, driving past these cooling towers and seeing big clouds coming out of the nuclear plant. And so there are no air pollutants like other fossil fuel pollutants. So there's CO2, there's nitrogen, there's sulfides, there's none of that. That's just water vapor. So there's no other air pollutants. In terms of the mining, milling, refining, that's where you see carbon emissions and other pollutants come from in the nuclear process. And that's why we included that graph that shows even when you take in the life cycle, all the life cycle emissions. So even creating the concrete to build the plants, mining for uranium, that nuclear still has the lowest. And partially that's because we need so little uranium, but also that uranium mining is very low intensive compared to other sources of mining. We can actually get uranium leached from groundwater and leached from the ocean as well, which hoping to do in the future, more so in the future. In terms of things so nothing leaks from waste. All of the waste, when we say it's contained, it all stays within that cask. So there's no liquid to leak there. When we talk about anything leaking, that would be in one of those accidents. So in a partial nuclear meltdown, there may be radioactive particles that are released into the environment. But with TMI, that was not the case. Chernobyl was different because it didn't have containment, but now all nuclear reactors have containment as a result. Sorry, that there is just a lot of questions in there, and I feel like I touched briefly on all of them and not enough on any of them.
Well,
So
I'm going to ask Jeff and Connie have had their hands up, and then I think we're going to start with David. And there are still many questions in the chat, but if we have time afterwards, we can address that.
Hey, Pat, we have a gentleman at the mic here.
I'm sorry, what?
We have a gentleman at the mic.
Oh, okay, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't see that.
Thank you. My name is Steve, and excellent presentation. I wonder if you could speak to the small nuclear reactors that are under development. I've read a little bit about that. I think it was Science Friday recently talked to it, and there's some development work both being done by the military and also some work supporting some remote areas in Alaska. And with those, you have a much lower footprint, smaller footprint, and then I would imagine once the development is complete and it's ready for mainstream, much more capital outlay to put in a small nuclear reactor that maybe could electricity for a metropolitan area in and of itself versus just the large nuclear reactor facilities that we're used to today.
Yeah, I mean, that's something Alan and I are particularly excited about for Illinois. So for context, the US has had a small nuclear reactor program for decades. It's called the Nuclear Navy. And we've had small nuclear reactors powering our submarines for decades. So now the idea is, can we have smaller reactors? So not big gigawatt scale plant reactors, but smaller reactors used for a number of things. Some of those things are in remote places that don't have as big of a grid and don't need as much electricity as a full-scale nuclear plant offers. Other things, and something that Alan and I are particularly excited about and advocating for, is placing smaller nuclear reactors on the site of retiring coal plants so that you can use the existing energy infrastructure, the existing transmission, the existing workforce to repower a coal plant to make it carbon free. So that not only allows for the jobs to remain in the community and the community to maintain their purpose as an energy provider, but also swap coal like for like and create a carbon free backbone for Illinois that allows us to decarbonize faster. So we are particularly excited about that. Also, a lot of these smaller reactors and more advanced reactors can do things that today's reactors can't, which are create high temperature steam. So electricity is just one small bit of our energy that we have to get to carbon free. There's also a significant amount.
Madison, Maddie, I'm
Yeah.
going to have to interrupt because we do
That's
need
fine.
to get on. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
As I'm looking at some of the chat questions, I think that some of these may be addressed by David. I see Jeff and Connie with their hands up, but I'd like to move on and see if maybe David will be able to address some of these questions as you talk. Okay, thank you.
Yes, I
Maddie and Alan.
we can certainly save the chat and maybe, between the three of them, they could send the chat. And maybe.
Okay, all right. David, you're on.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to thank everyone for joining us here tonight. My name is Dave Kraft. I'm Director of Nuclear Energy Information Service in Chicago. We're a 42-year-old anti-nuclear safe energy advocacy organization. We have been opposed to nuclear power. We think there are better ways of getting energy. And we also advocate for responsible nuclear waste disposal and the elimination of nuclear weapons. I'm going to do something impossible, I hope. I have combined 3 40-minute PowerPoints into what I hope will be a 30-minute presentation. If I make it, I expect nominations for the Guinness Record book. But if I don't, I put my name and contact information in the chat. You can send me emails for questions. Or if your organization would like to sample each of those 40-minute PowerPoints where the devils clearly lie in the details, we'll be glad to do that for you. Before I actually get into my presentation, I just want to read something written by a guy named Michael Brune in 2016. And this was in response to the Wall Street Journal's mischaracterization that environmental groups were becoming pro-nuclear again. And the Wall Street Journal had lumped Sierra Club into that. Brune responded by saying, "The article reflects wishful thinking on the part of the nuclear industry and does not accurately represent the position of the Sierra Club. It is categorically incorrect to suggest that the Sierra Club considers nuclear power a bridge to clean energy. Nuclear power, much like coal, oil, and gas, is a bridge to nowhere." I'm going to go into my presentation now. Hopefully the screen share will work. Okay, here we go. The previous presentation I want to compliment was a very good nuclear power primer, very good on basics. And the problem with nuclear, though, is a lot of what goes on with it lies in the details. And we won't necessarily have time to get into those details. I'll do the best I can, but I would point out that there was a lot that I would contest in terms of the accuracy, not the least of which I'm grateful that Madigan was standing next to fresh fuel in that picture. Had it been truly irradiated fuel, she would have been dead in 4 minutes. So the waste is not quite as benign as was portrayed. And that's what we find sometimes with nuclear presentations, is you get very broad brush strokes of very positive things, suggesting we have it under control. But the history of nuclear power really suggests a much more mixed analysis. I also found that the previous presentation didn't address the question tonight. What is nuclear's role in a climate disruptive world? We would say you can't nuke climate change because we've been saying it since 1999. Having trouble advance here. Here we go. So I'm going to break this up into 3 parts. We're going to look at nuclear power plants as they are, the old ones. We will talk about those small modulars, which came up in the question a minute ago. And I've added a section that never gets discussed, not in presentations like this, not in Springfield or in Washington, issues that get ignored, that are a part of the nuclear issue and never get adequately addressed. So the first part of the presentation is nuclear power is really a don't look up moment. And I'm referring here to that legendary and Academy Award nominated movie of late 2021, early 2022 on climate disruption, the allegory about climate change, a comet coming to destroy Earth, an existential threat. You got a lot of basics on nuclear. I'm going to add a few more because they will be important. There are only 411 reactors operating now in the world today, and only 53 more are under construction. That gives us currently about 9.8% of the world's electrical output. However, about 100, whoops, sorry about that. By 2030, the World Nuclear Association estimates that about 135 of those reactors will be closing. So if you add, 50 or so, you're really going to come at a deficit. Nuclear is in decline. In terms of the United States, we only have 92 reactors. You might remember President Nixon wanted 1,000 reactors up the coast of California back in the 1980s. It didn't happen for a good reason. There are no more large reactors planned. And there are a number of reactors slated for closure in the next 10 to 15 years. I put this number up as a reminder of what we're talking about tonight. We've crossed the 400 parts per million threshold on carbon, and it's only going up. And we have to act like Gretchen Thunberg says, like this is a crisis. And doing business as usual is not acting like it's a crisis. And I'd like to illustrate some of what I call some of the nuclear myth takes or mythology of nuclear. And you heard some of those tonight, that we have nuclear waste under control. We need nuclear power to fight climate change. The French love their nuclear power. We can recycle spent fuel. This is the messaging of the nuclear industry and its advocates in government that have been going on for the last 30 years. And when you scratch the surface and go to the details, you find that these really are wishful thinking. Now, since 1999, my organization invented what we call the 2x4 rule of climate abatement. Back in the 90s, you needed a 2x4 to whack over the head of some of the climate deniers to get them to listen to you. So we figured that would be a good idea. So we have a 2x4 on climate disruption. It's governed by 2 constraints and 4 rules. And any energy resource that is selected for climate work needs to meet these. The first are survival constraints. We have a limited amount of time and a limited amount of money, and that is told by everybody. It's only 7 years or so left until we get to 2030, which was the big milestone that the IPCC put out. And when you look at the estimates of what's needed to actually reinvent our energy system, Morgan Stanley came out with a report suggesting $50 trillion has to be spent by 2050. I'll keep that number in mind because I'm going to come back to it later. But now, with the situation in Ukraine and elsewhere, We also have another survival constraint, and that's security. But nobody's ever heard of a 3x4, so we're going to stick with 2x4. The rules are very important. Whatever you pick has to remove the most amount of carbon out of the atmosphere in the shortest amount of time at the lowest cost. And here's the kicker: without creating or substituting equally environmentally damaging, socially unjust, or unacceptable planetary threatening alternatives. And we would say, and we will illustrate in the next few minutes, that nuclear power in its current form fails these constraints and rules, and in the future form. Let's look at time. What does this mean? We have 6 years and 10 months left before we get to 2030. According to the IPCC, if we have any hope of staying to 1.5, which I think we pretty much all discarded by now. The best thing to do is do the math. Don't just guess. So let's take a look at some of the math. I put this presentation together a long time ago, but I left in some of these little numbers to show you that people were thinking about these concerns 20 years ago. MIT did a study suggesting we need 1,500 new reactors by 2050. A man named Robert Williams suggested by the year 2100, we would need nearly 5,000 reactors. And even with that, you would only reduce world carbon by 20%. The Institute for Energy and Environmental Research suggests we need 2,000 reactors by 2040. How many are operating? 411. How many are under construction? 53. How many are scheduled to close? 130. Do the math. So I prorated this out. First set of numbers is when I first made the slideshow up and the dates of the studies that you heard. But then I just did this yesterday, that from today, if you took the MIT numbers, you'd need to build a reactor every 6.6 days. If you took the IEER estimate of 2,000 reactors by 2040, you need to build a reactor every 3.1 days. And if you do the Williams program by 2100, you need a reactor every 5.7 days, and still you would only reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere by 20% for that investment. Under construction, China, of course, the most, but this slide illustrates some information that just came out in a report last October that many of the reactors under construction are behind schedule. In fact, 26, almost half of the reactors are experiencing construction delays of 1 year or more. So nuclear power is not suited for fast startups or coming online anytime soon. Here are some of the poster children for failure. The vaunted French, the nuclear poster child, have a reactor 8 years behind schedule, and depending on your estimates, anywhere from 9 to 16 billion euros over budget. The Finns just put a new reactor online 13 years late and over budget. And the Vogtle reactors in the United States, excuse me, having a little issue here. They're 8 years behind schedule, $21 billion over budget for a total projected cost of $34 billion for 2 reactors. Once again, let's do the math on cost. It's not the no nukes kook saying that it's expensive and shouldn't be built. It's the former head of the International Energy Agency in 2018. Going back to those studies that I mentioned, excuse me, this gives you an idea of the construction costs. Now, construction costs are calculated different ways, so this unfortunately is a mix of 2 different costs. But what you see here over time is an obvious trend of escalating reactor cost. Way back in 2003, they were quoting $2.3 billion per reactor. Now we have the 2 Vogtle reactors coming in at $17 billion over cost. So it's ridiculous. This slide is impossible to read, but the top bar is the suggested overnight cost for advanced reactors. Those are those small reactors, a group of those small reactors that were mentioned in the question and answer. The second from the bottom and the third from the bottom are solar, photovoltaic, and wind. So in terms of cost per dollars per kilowatt hour, it's a no-brainer. So going back to those studies, let's take the Moody's study first. At $5 billion per gigawatt, 1,500 reactors, it would give you a lowball figure of $7.5 trillion to build those 1,500. If you took Williams, you'd go up to $24.5 trillion. And remember that it was suggested we need to spend upwards of 50 trillion between now and 2050. This wouldn't leave a whole heck of a lot for anything else, would it? And if the reactors cost more, which Moody's suggests here, there would even be less available for other energy resources. Now, I compare that to the Republicans yelling and screaming that we couldn't afford the real Green New Deal. They calculated that the price tag of 8.3 trillion and 12.3 trillion was too much, but it would get us to 100% renewables and with energy efficiency and renewables and eliminate carbon emissions from power plant and transport sectors. That 12.3 trillion is a lot less than the 30-some trillion that was suggested in the Williams study that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Yet I don't hear the Republicans getting too upset about spending that money on nuclear. Can we afford it? We have to afford it. This is an existential crisis. The climate says we have to do something, but it shouldn't be wasting money and time on things that won't give you a good result. The nuclear bailouts were mentioned. It's interesting enough, I read an op-ed that was written by our presenters tonight, which appeared in the Daily Herald a couple of weekends ago. And they talk about the massive subsidization of renewables. Yet in the last decade alone, the bailouts in these states, Ohio, Georgia, South Carolina, Illinois, and New York, total $42.8 billion, 81 times the Solyndra bankruptcy, which the Republicans and members of Congress who are pro-nuclear got so upset about. So when we talk about subsidization, you definitely have to include nuclear power in that. And last but not least, I mentioned that it's hard to do cost comparisons because it's a GIGO situation. It depends what you build in your calculations. But here is a nifty chart of several different calculation methods that was put together for various energy resources. The important thing is not whether the numbers themselves are accurate. The importance of this chart is the trend it demonstrates, that over 5 different evaluative resources, onshore wind and solar power, constantly are cheaper than nuclear power on every measure. So that is the trend, no matter how you calculate cost. In a climate disrupted world, what's going to be the most important resource, even more than today? Water. Nuclear reactors use a lot of water. They use more water than coal plants, for example. And what we've seen this year is that climate is very unpredictable. We don't know where the droughts will be necessarily. And we've already experienced effects of drought and low water supply on nuclear. In fact, 1988, Illinois had a severe drought, which actually curtailed or shut down 100 reactor days of Commonwealth Edison's nuclear plants here in Illinois. Just going to last summer, the vaunted French nuclear industry, which gets 70% of its electricity from nuclear, unfortunately had to shut down 32 of 54 reactors because of the extreme drought, the lack of water in the French rivers, and the discovery of design flaw cracks in the designs of the reactors. So we had a situation, a double whammy in France, where the majority of the reactors were closed. And guess what they had to do to make up the power? They had to buy dirty lignite coal from Germany to keep the lights on and the air conditioners running. So this really throws a boomerang in the idea that nuclear is going to be reliable in a climate disrupted world where you're not going to know where the water is going to come from. Other issues, there will be more high-level radioactive waste to dispose of the longer you keep reactors operating. Many of you may not know that the industry and its friends at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and government are trying to operate reactors for 80 years instead of the 40 years they were initially designed for. Older reactors are going to be higher to maintain. There will be degradation of hardware. You'll need more bailouts like we just had here in Illinois, over $3 billion in the last 6 years. And there will be routine radioactive emissions and increased potential for accidents. And as I said, radioactive waste will continue to pile up. But apparently that doesn't concern many in government or in the nuclear industry, even though we don't have a solution for disposal. We calculated that if the Illinois reactors were allowed to operate for 80 years, it would more than double the amount of high-level radioactive waste that is currently being stored at these reactors. You'd have over 21,000 metric tons of high-level radioactive waste sitting in Illinois with no disposals, right? No place to go, no place to put it. And the federal government has announced that the soonest they could get, under the most optimistic scenarios for disposal, is a repository by 2048. And nobody's doing anything to advance that date right now. So that waste is going to sit here. So who says nuclear isn't going to work? Not the no-nukes kooks, but the senior vice president and chief strategy officer at Exelon, William Van Hoen, back in 2018. He doesn't think there are going to be more reactors built in Illinois, in the country. Also, I would mention Michael Brune said so. Bruce Hamilton, the Sierra Club National Policy Director, energy analyst Amory Lovins, energy specialist Dr. Mark Jacobson, Dr. Arjun Makajani, two former nuclear regulatory chairpersons and other commissioners have made the same thing, made the statement. So if we don't use nuclear, what do we do in a climate disruptive world? Well, the first thing you have to consider is you don't do everything. Because if you end up trying to do everything, you end up doing nothing. So this idea that everything is on the table, we have to take everything under consideration, we have to fund everything, is absolute nonsense. And it was probably put together best in one of the best quotations, I would say, of the first part of the 20th century by the former Nuclear Regulatory Commissioner, Peter Bradford. One moment, please. He was also the Public Utilities Chair for the states of Maine and New York, who points out that we can't afford to do everything. We have to pick and choose. The urgency of world hunger doesn't compel us to fight it with caviar, no matter how nourishing fish eggs might be. Spending large sums on elegant solutions that will provide us with little effect takes money from what we can actually do. Sorry about this. So you have to also question, how genuine is that statement that everything is under consideration? We have to do all of the above. Are these under consideration? How about ending predatory capitalism or rampant consumerism? How about an immediate elimination of fossil fuel and nuclear subsidies? Is that on the table? How about declaring a climate emergency, President Biden? Or declaring fossil fuels a national threat and closing the industry under eminent domain? How about freezing the standard of living in the first world so that the third world can catch up? If these aren't on the table for consideration, then you see what a lot of BS the notion of considering everything really is. And once again, we remind you it's a crisis. But if you're going to treat it as a crisis, you have to act that way. And if the system we have can't do it, we need a new system. So the plans are out there. They've been out there for years. Carbon-free, nuclear-free was written in 2007. Jacobson's 100% Clean Energy came out 2 years ago. His new book just came out, No Miracles Needed. The plans are there. We know what to do. Excuse me a minute. People question, can we run large economies on renewables? Well, it's already happening. Everyone talks about the Chinese nuclear program. Well, the statistics as of late last year, December of last year, illustrate in China, the installed capacity of wind is the equivalent of 115 nuclear power plants if you adjust for intermittency. Solar, the equivalent of 66 nuclear power plants if you adjust for the intermittency. Nuclear only has 52 gigawatts. So clearly the Chinese see where it's wise to invest their future in terms of energy. It's with renewables, and they're already doing it, and they already have the largest economy in the world. Same thing in India. They're seeing that Renewables are contributing more than nuclear does. And just this past year, worldwide, the combination of the two renewables surpassed nuclear for the first time. So it's already happening. I'll skip through some of these in the interest of time. So, is nuclear crucial to climate change? Not according to Gregory Yatsko, the former chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He says, if you would go with nuclear, it's going to fail. It's just not up to the task. Now I'm going to move to part two. These next two should go a little quicker. The first part is the small modular reactors. And it's a broad brushstroke term. There are actually three categories of this, but these also are not going to be effective in the climate crisis fight for a lot of reasons. The first is you have to apply the 2x4 rule again. And it's important to point out that these nuclear power point reactors don't even exist. And they're not going to exist in numbers that would deal with the climate change until well past 2030. So that's why we call them nuclear power point reactors. They don't exist. Only one reactor design out of 12 under submission has been approved. And that one is up for reconsideration because the company changed the design. Often the claims are theoretical, overblown, can't be demonstrated, or are fraudulent. It's been shown that smaller reactors will not be economical, not only compared to today's nuclear power plants, but compared to the alternatives that are available: wind, solar, energy efficiency. The proposals out there for small modular reactors trade safety for cost reduction. They will be cheaper because they won't build containment buildings. They will have reduced staff on site. So we're losing the so-called defense in depth that the current generation of reactors has because the small modulars are going to winnow it away on promises. They've also been calculated to produce more radioactive waste per unit of energy you get back. And some of the fuel they have to use is highly enriched compared to the reactor fuel we have now, which makes it just under the threshold to be eligible for nuclear weapons production. And what's worse is the only place you can get that fuel right now is from Russia. It's called HALEU, high assay, low enriched uranium. So this creates a proliferation threat. And again, who says that small modulars won't work? Two of the former chair people of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Greg Yatsko on the left, Allison McFarland on the right. Also, internationally, there's pushback against small modulars from former energy analysts and executives in various countries like Germany, France, the United Kingdom. So it's not just our people who are saying it. Internationally, people are seeing that small modulars don't have a future. The claims are overblown. There have been examples of far overreach of predictions. A study came out by the Union of Concerned Scientists last year called Advanced Isn't Always Better, goes into great detail with the flaws of the advanced reactors. And the reactors like NuScale that are out there now are experiencing cost delays and escalations. I have to hold on just for a moment here. This next section may be the most important because these are the issues that never get discussed. I'll run through them fast in case we have to stop, but I'll go into detail if I can. You have to understand that the decision about nuclear isn't whether it should happen in Illinois or even in the United States. Decisions we make here have global impacts and implications. The decisions we made on CEJA and FEJA in Illinois had massive implications for nuclear power nationwide, and we couldn't get the environmental community to see past that. They were focusing narrowly on getting legislation passed. We can't afford to do that with the climate crisis. It is a global crisis. There are significant environmental justice issues with nuclear that never get brought up, and we will go into detail on those. We can't ignore the vast amount of political corruption that has taken place with nuclear, both in terms of the politicians and the industry itself. You have to look at the past performance of nuclear. And you have to also acknowledge, unlike what the industry says, nuclear power is a fig leaf for nuclear weapons and proliferation. And I'll demonstrate that in detail in a moment. It's good idea to take a look at who wants nuclear reactors too. And then finally, we've had our nose pushed in the fan on Ukraine. Nuclear power in war zones now has to be considered front and center. So what about the corruption? Massive scandals in Illinois with Michael Madigan, in Ohio with the former Speaker of the House, Larry Householder, a bribery scandal pled guilty in South Carolina, totaling tens of billions of dollars. This is the nuclear industry. Environmental justice issues. Most of the uranium mining needed to get the fuel takes place on indigenous lands and contaminates those lands very often, most often, almost always, contaminating the lands without cleanup. The White House Environmental Justice Advisory Committee does not support nuclear power. Environmental justice groups opposed it in the IRA legislation, and environmental justice groups and activists oppose premature storage facilities in Texas and New Mexico. Excuse me a moment. We need to acknowledge that the nuclear industry has never been a friend of renewable energy. Whether it was Commonwealth Edison when my group first started in the 80s, or Exelon Corporation, or now Constellation Energy, they've always been competitors, and they've always undercut the renewable energy industry. They've never been able to make cost and time deadlines, and they're invested in preserving the status quo. Are these the people you think are going to save you from climate disruption? Probably not. I mentioned nuclear power is a fig leaf for nuclear weapons. And it's not just us saying it. It's the former Secretary of Energy of the United States, Ernie Moniz, who said it. And a few years ago, the President of France, who said it. One cannot exist without the other. Who wants nuclear power? The Biden administration. The two pieces of legislation recently passed, it was calculated that at up to $70 billion is earmarked for some nuclear projects. I calculated out $70 billion, and that translates to about 35,000 2-megawatt wind turbines, which is the equivalent of 12 nuclear power stations. But those won't be built because that $70 billion will go to nuclear. Conservative governments want it, governments like Poland. Most especially governments who want nuclear weapons or who are authoritarian, anti-democratic, centralized, autocratic. Those are the ones who want nuclear power. Why would Saudi Arabia want nuclear power? Did the sun stop shining in Saudi Arabia or in Egypt? It boggles the mind, as they say. And last but not least, nuclear power in war zones. The World's Nuclear Industry Status Report mentions that no nuclear power plant in the world has been designed to operate under the war conditions that we're experiencing in Ukraine. And I'd have to ask the proponents of the small modulars. They want to sprinkle these around the world because they're small and transportable and supposedly safer. But I have to ask you to do a thought experiment. Let's say Ukraine got these modular reactors 10 or 20 years ago, and they sent 200 of those reactors to the industrial section of Mariupol. My question here is, where exactly would you have put them where they would be safe? Many of the designs will be below ground, underground. But take a look at some of these crater holes. These are reactors that will be built without containments. They want smaller safety zones. They want regulations removed. They want to trade them like commerce, making them much easier to proliferate around the world. And the world is not a friendly place these days. I don't know if you've noticed. Some potential war zones. I don't have to tell you what they are. You know what they are. So what does this add up to? I don't think there's anyone on the call tonight who remembers this, but back in the 1930s, France faced an existential threat too. They were afraid of Germany. They decided the way they would protect themselves would be to build this powerful fortress line that would keep the Germans out. But in 1940, the Germans fooled them. They went around the line. So after spending 3 billion francs and making lots of money for contractors, administrators, maybe academia too, who knows? The project, the Maginot Line, failed miserably in its stated purpose, to defend France from imminent threat. And we would put it to you that nuclear power is the energy Maginot Line in the climate fight. It will spend lots of money and miserably fail to protect us from the climate threat. In putting this together, I remembered a quote from an old friend and colleague, Dennis Hayes, who was the founder of Earth Day. And on Earth Day 40, he came out with this quote. He suggested that we have to get our crap detectors going because only the most gullible are buying what the nuclear industry is selling. It was right back in 2010. It's just as right in 2023. So in conclusion, nuclear power is the energy Maginot Line. It'll cost a bundle, but it will be ineffective at reducing the climate crisis. Small reactors are PowerPoint reactors. They don't exist and they can't be built in numbers sufficient to meet the climate crisis. Nuclear's purpose really is to continue the status quo, serve as a fig leaf for weapons production, and make a heck of a lot of money for academia, through DOE grants, for construction firms, for entrepreneurs, for people like Bill Gates and the people who are investing in them to get more DOE grants. So what we urge you all to do, we say, do look up. You remember in the movie, the president and all their advisors are saying, don't look up for the comet. It's not really there. Pretend it's not there. Just keep your red hats on. But we say, do look up and incorporate this information in your decisions. Because our message in 2023 is very similar to that of Kate Dibiasky. If we don't address the climate crisis using the 2x4 rules, we are going to fail. We can't nuke climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. And thank everybody. I think there are two other presenters as well. And while Pat is getting chatted questions, I apologize for not introducing you, David. Just briefly, I just have to say that you collaborated to help found the Nuclear Energy Information Service in 1981, which apparently don't email over there right now because I guess it's your experience with hacking problems. But he did put your email in the chat, so it's available, and we will try to get that chat out. We're recording this, and when the recording available, we'll have the chat available too. Send it to our three presenters, and maybe David's advocacy is not only known here in the Chicagoland area, Illinois, but also all over the United States and worldwide, as he's been very visible with his advocacy. So anyway, Pat, do we have some questions?
Well, Jeff had his hand up from before, so I'm going to ask him to go ahead, and then Steve, and then I'm looking for things in the chat that'll come up after that. So go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you, Pat. I was surprised to see Madison make the argument that nuclear power is a cost-effective approach. And I have a question for Madison or Alan. in the 100 or so nuclear plants that have been built in the US since the 1970s, how many of those have been built without massive cost overrun? And how many of those have been built and operated on the schedule that was originally set when the plants were approved?
Oh, we will not disagree with you, Jeff, on the absolute complete failure of the nuclear industry to deliver anything on time or on budget. I mean, partially that's just a problem with construction of mega projects in America, is that they're always behind schedule and always over budget. And that's particularly true of the nuclear industry. So we're not saying that the price tag, like I said, it's extremely high, and it's always higher than what the industry says it's going to be. If they say it, at least double the cost and double the time. Our argument is not that it's easy. It's not easy. Building nuclear isn't easy. It's not that it's cheap up front. It's very costly. In fact, it nearly bankrupted a venerable American manufacturer in Westinghouse. What we're saying is that given the lifetime of these plants, as David points out, the NRC is licensing plants out to 80 years. It's looking at 100. That when you look at the cost of the electricity they generate, it's extremely cheap. And we see from MIT, from the IPCC, we mentioned the IPCC 1.5 scenario. There is no scenario that doesn't include a growth of nuclear power, doubling of nuclear power in the IPCC. And that's because new systems that have nuclear or hydro or some sort of reliable carbon-free power as their backbone to provide when wind and solar can't, that those systems end up cheaper.
I just want to say real quick, Pat, I know you have other questions, but again, if somebody misses their cost estimate once or twice or three times, but 120 times, I think it was Einstein that said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And this industry has continually failed. Forbes Business Magazine called it the greatest managerial disaster in U.S. history. It sounds like Madison would agree with me. And I just can't see why we would want to go down that path when we know what the cost of solar and wind are. We know they're cheaper than nuclear, even if nuclear meets its budgets, and it'll be a lot less cheaper when nuclear has its typical cost overruns. Thank you.
Yep, I will just comment quickly that the cost of solar and wind in those analyses, the levelized cost of electricity, look at the plant level data. They do not take into account the cost of the system. So the backup capacity needed, the additional transmission, the storage needed. So that's why instead of looking at the cost of each individual plant or project, we look at nations' electricity systems and grids as a whole. And that's what we think, because we're not trying to make a cheap power plant. We're trying to make a cheap electricity system, because that's what creates a just and equitable society.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. I'm finished.
Well, actually, there's a question here that's kind of a follow-up to what you're saying, and then I'm going to come back to Steve. So the question here is that, to David, you had a slide on how many reactors we'd have to build per day to avoid climate catastrophe. Do you have information on how many wind turbines we'd have to build per day for that, and how many solar panels?
I gave a hint in that kind of thumbnail calculation I gave in terms of the Biden administration's allocations. But I would point out that you can erect a wind farm within 2 to 4 years, first of all. Solar even comes in a little quicker than that. As Madison, I think, even pointed out correctly, the land use on both of those are dual purpose. You can use the land in wind turbine and wind farms for grazing. And many of you know that that one of the new trends in agriculture is called agrivoltaics, because some crops actually thrive being planted under solar panels. They're experimenting and collecting data. Now, I mentioned that because those are factors you got to take in too if you do choose to go to renewables. How many? I couldn't give you a number, but that $70 billion that the Biden administration is throwing at nuclear would get you 35,000 land-based 2 megawatt turbines. And What's more, the technology is advancing, unlike nuclear, I would say, to the fact that wind turbine towers are being elevated to higher heights, which means they're going to get more energy per turbine, and they're going to have larger blades. So you will be getting more energy as the technology improves. In a climate disrupted world, you get less energy from nuclear reactors because of the physics of the system. It actually degrades the amount of power output because of the hot water that is used in a climate disrupted world. So again, I can't give you an exact number, but I do know, and this has been shown, that when wind or solar is substituted, it's pretty much a 1-to-1 substitution in the fossil fuels. So for example, if you took a gigawatt, if you use solar or wind, a gigawatt of that would take off a gigawatt of fossil fuels. So it's a 1-to-1 trade there. So if we can do it with nuclear, we can certainly do it with renewables.
Thank you, Steve.
I hope that answered the question, or at least approached the direction that you were asking the question.
Stephen, you had your hand up. Why don't you go ahead, please?
Yeah, this is Stephen Sondheim. I live in Chicago. I'm a Sierra Club member. Couple of things. I think we're under the myth that renewables aren't ready. They're already cheaper, and they're already providing a major portion. And if given both the non-competitive thing, because there are utilities that are fighting renewable and fighting transmission and fighting storage, given they could do it, and they could probably do it close to 2030. We know that nuclear probably can't do it till 2040, 2050. And this doing it is really, really important. The other thing I wanted to reinforce, and it's sort of my belief, we know there's lots of problems with nuclear. Danger problems, safety problems, you name it. But the biggest thing is the amount of money to do nuclear versus renewable is just huge. I've seen 4 to 8 to 10 times. And a lot of that money either comes out of the public or it's already coming out of the consumers. Look at the price of energy in Illinois, in Ohio.
Excuse me, Steve, could you come to a point with a question so we can move on? I understand you have a lot of passion about what you're talking about, but I'd like to focus on questions right now, if you don't mind.
Well, I'm making more of a comment, but the question is, would it not be better to do something that we could do sooner and less expensive? To me, that's the key point.
Well, I think that was sort of what David was saying, but there's another question here I wanted to bring up because this is a specific. Has there ever been a federal GAO study on nuclear power economics and competitively with other energy sources and other energy sources? I don't know if David or Maddie or Alan, I'm not sure who would want to take this.
Sorry, is this in the chat?
Yeah, why has there never been a federal GAO study on nuclear power economics and competitiveness with other energy sources?
I'm not sure about the GAO, but there have been analyses done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, by MIT, by the University of Michigan's Fastest Path to Zero group, by the US Department of Energy. And so I'm happy to send a follow-up email with all of those analyses. But in all of those scenarios, it shows that the lowest cost, low carbon system includes some sort of dispatchable carbon-free power. So that could come from hydro, nuclear, geothermal, but there needs to be something that is carbon-free that can take over when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. Otherwise, it's fossil fuels for the time being.
Paul, did you have a question or a comment? Because I was looking for questions right now.
If I could just add
you said Paul?
Paul Gunter.
Okay, very good. Well, Mr. Metzger and Ms. Hilly have said a lot of disingenuous things here, but I just have a question about the nuclear waste being piled up on the football field up to 50 feet deep. Would the, if you're piling up that much nuclear fuel, this is unshielded, obviously, would not all the people in the bleachers be dead?
I mean, we certainly didn't.
Are you aware of what unshielded high-level nuclear waste would do to the stadium full of people?
It's just an illustration to show you the volume, that's all.
I know, but it's, again, there has been a lot said here that is disingenuous.
What was
Excuse me,
disingenuous
Paul.
about that? I'm sorry.
This is a question and answer thing. Can we please just
Right.
maybe focus
Well,
on
then
that?
answer the question. If you pile a football field full of nuclear waste, would not everybody in the stadium be dead?
Paul, I don't think that anyone suggested that specifically.
No,
I would
you
not
are
suggest that.
You are suggesting that, you're equating that it's insignificant. The volume is not the issue. The issue is the curie count of that much nuclear waste. And that's why they're looking to put it thousands of feet underground. Now, so when you make these arguments, you make the same argument for safety. Would you be willing to abandon the Price-Anderson Act if these nuclear power stations are so inherently safe? Are you willing to give up the limited liability coverage from the US taxpayer, which is now limited to $12.6 billion per nuclear accident, when Fukushima is now approaching 360 billion? Chernobyl is now approaching 500 billion. And you want...
Excuse me, Paul, could you please focus on the question? Because I have one more thing I'd like to.
Would you support giving up the Price-Anderson Act so that you can build these small modular reactors? Or are you going to seek the limited liability coverage of the US taxpayer for a potential accident that you say won't happen?
Okay, I don't know if that was a question, but I appreciate your passion and your comment. So, we're getting a little late here, and I do know that there's still a lot of questions in the chat. And I just, wanted to, I don't see anything here that is, I see a lot of comments one way or the other, which I know both of you can see. But what I'd like to suggest is, since we're a little over schedule here, I'm going to save the chat, and I'm going to stop recording.